Good morning to everyone. Our subcommittee will now come to order. Pursuant to notice, the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment meets to consider the following measures: H.R. 2693, the Federal Oil Spill Research Program Act; H.R. 2729, to authorize the designation of national environment research parks by the Secretary of Energy and for other purposes; and H.R. 1622, to provide for a program of research, development, and demonstration on natural gas vehicles. We'll now proceed with the markup. This morning, the Energy and Environment Subcommittee meets to consider, as mentioned, three pieces of legislation: the Federal Oil Pollution Research Program Act, which is H.R. 2693, also H.R. 2729, a bill to authorize the Department of Energy's National Environment Research Parks, and H.R. 1622, a bill to provide for a program of research and development of vehicles that operate using natural gas as a fuel. First, the subcommittee will consider H.R. 2693, authored by Ms. Woolsey from California, which amends the Federal Interagency Research and Development Program created in the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. This bill would improve the federal government's research and development efforts to prevent, detect, or mitigate oil discharges. Through this reauthorization, federal agencies will be better equipped to respond to oil discharges wherever they occur. We will also mark up H.R. 2729, a bill introduced by Mr. Lujan from New Mexico, to authorize the Department of Energy's 7 national environment research parks. These parks are truly a national treasure, providing large tracts of land that represent nearly all of the major ecoregions in the United States. They're a valuable resource for examining the transport of DOE-related contaminants, long-term impacts of climate change, and the various ways carbon is captured and released within the ecosystem. I'm pleased to be a co-sponsor of both H.R. 2693 and 2729, and I encourage colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join in supporting those important bills. Finally, the subcommittee will consider H.R. 1622, a bill introduced by Mr. Sullivan of Oklahoma and co-sponsored by full committee ranking member Mr. Hall. This bill reauthorizes the Department of Energy's Research, Development, and Demonstration Program in natural gas-powered vehicles and related infrastructure. To transform our nation's energy sector, we must explore a diverse range of fuels and vehicle technologies. While only a piece in a very complex puzzle, natural gas can potentially provide us with an option that is both cleaner than petroleum and more domestically available. I look forward to the discussion on the bill and moving it towards a full committee markup. I thank the members for their participation this morning and look forward to a productive markup. I now recognize Mr. Inglis to present opening remarks.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. Today we will address several pieces of legislation that highlight the diversity of federal research initiatives into pressing environmental and energy-related problems. It's an opportunity to reflect on our broad jurisdiction and to ensure the federal research dollars are focused and well spent. The first bill before us, the Federal Oil Spill Research Program Act, will revitalize the federal research effort focused on the prevention, detection, and mitigation of oil spills. While this is critical research, and I commend Ms. Woolsey's dedication to this important issue, I'm not confident that H.R. 2693 is necessary to improve the interagency commitment to oil spill research. The testimony heard on this topic 2 weeks ago indicated that the interagency process seems to be working. The witnesses indicated that the most significant problems were related to limited funding and poor communication with the states. Further, this bill makes NOAA the chair of the Interagency Research Committee, though other federal agencies seem better geared toward leading this particular research effort. The second bill is H.R. 2729, a bill to permanently authorize national environmental research parks. I appreciate Mr. Lujan's leadership in this area. These facilities are a unique environmental research asset. The Environmental Research Park at the Savannah River site, for example, has provided South Carolina and Georgia students with the opportunity to engage in research in our local ecologies. Especially as we develop new energy alternatives, our national environmental research parks will help us understand how our energy choices impact our distinct ecosystems. I'd also like to speak in support of H.R. 1622 and commend Mr. Sullivan for his leadership in promoting the development of natural gas vehicles. As long as we rely on oil to power our transportation sector, the U.S. will be dependent on hostile foreign nations and will continue to fund both sides of the war on terror. H.R. 1622 will utilize American ingenuity to increase competition in fuel choice in the transportation sector, spurring our innovation economy and increasing our national security. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to developing legislation that truly improves our diverse federal research efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Inglis. Members may place any statements for the record at this point. We will now consider H.R. 2693, the Federal Oil Spill Research Program Act. I'm pleased to recognize Ms. Woolsey to present any additional remarks on her legislation.
To prevent?
Present.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this markup today. As some of you remember, on November 7th, 2007, the container ship COSCO Busan collided with the San Francisco Bay Bridge and released 58,000 gallons of oil into San Francisco Bay. Although this was considered a minor spill by comparison, the impact to my district was widespread. The pristine beaches of Marin County were soiled, waters off our federal parklands were sullied, and important restoration projects in Richardson and San Pablo Bay were threatened. All in all, about 200 miles of coastline were affected. In addition, the spill killed thousands of birds, many marine mammals, and no one knows how many fish. That's why I've introduced H.R. 2693, the Federal Oil Spill Research Program Act. This bill reorganizes the agencies responsible for federal research and development of oil spill prevention, detection, recovery, and mitigation to ensure that the three agencies with the most expertise in this area are working together for common solutions in the most effective and efficient way possible. Although under current law, there are 14 separate agencies tasked with oil spill research. When the committee held a hearing on this bill, it became clear that the Coast Guard, the EPA, and NOAA are, in fact, the most engaged. As a result, H.R. 2693 creates the Federal Oil Spill Research Committee to give these three agencies the primary responsibility for our federal oil spill prevention activities. In the aftermath of the COSCO Busan spill, one thing that I heard again and again from the people who were tasked with cleaning up our mess was that the technology they were using wasn't adequate to get the job done. And the committee heard similar testimonies from experts who testified on H.R. 2693. That's why this bill also provides grants to institutes of higher learning and research centers to improve technologies used to prevent, combat, and clean up oil spills. It's clear that current technology is inadequate to prevent and protect us from oil spills, as the average recovery is only between 10 and 15%. And I know with the right focus and the effort that we need, we can do much, much better. H.R. 2693 will help to ensure that the federal government is taking an active role to prevent oil spills, and that when they do occur, we have the best possible technology to minimize negative impacts to ourselves and to our environment. Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you for holding this markup. I urge my colleagues to support this H.R. 2693.
Thank you, Ms. Woolsey. I commend you for your passion in this. Clearly, you have such dedication. You always have since for many years in the Congress, and I applaud you for that and for addressing it so vigorously with this legislation. Thank you for your work on this. Chair now recognizes Mr. Inglis for opening remarks on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we'll have several questions about this bill, and in fact, I've got an amendment I'll offer. The main question really has to do with why are we choosing NOAA as the chair for the interagency committee? Currently, it's the Coast Guard. NOAA receives no funding from the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. They do not act as an on-scene coordinator for either land-based or marine-based oil discharges. Their research and development is heavily focused on restoration and habitat recovery for the long term instead of prevention, response, and oil recovery immediately after a spill. And so as we proceed here, that'll be a question I'll be asking in the form of an amendment, really, to ask whether really Coast Guard is better equipped to handle these functions than NOAA. But in the interest of time, why don't we proceed on to the amendments, and I'd be happy to yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Is there anyone else wishing to be recognized on this legislation? I would ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and the members proceed with the amendments in the order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered. The first amendment on the roster is a manager's amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. Ms. Woolsey, are you ready to proceed, Ms. Woolsey?
Mr. Chairman, I am. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2693, amendment number 141, offered by Ms. Woolsey of California.
Ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I offer this manager's amendment to make a series of changes throughout H.R. 2693 to clarify the intent of the legislation and to incorporate recommendations from the legislative hearing held on June 4th. To start, this amendment replaces the term oil spill with oil pollution to better explain the scope of the program, which includes research into oil discharges both on water and on land. Section 2 of the bill is amended to provide for more effective notification to the public about the activities of the program, including information on existing volunteer training opportunities in incident response. Section 3 of the bill is amended to clarify some of the elements of the interagency research program. It also adds additional program elements, including research into the mechanical, chemical, and biological methods for the recovery, removal, and disposal of oil, technologies, methods, and standards for protecting removal personnel and volunteers that may participate in incident response, improved information systems to assist federal response efforts, and methods to restore and rehabilitate natural resources damaged by oil discharges. A new Section 4 of the bill is inserted to allow for the continuation of an existing technology evaluation program that will be supplemented with guidance from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. The manager's amendment also modifies the contents of the Interagency Committee's research assessment. It specifically adds a new requirement to identify emerging technologies and the barriers to the utilization of those technologies by federal response teams. In addition, the manager's amendment clarifies that the assessment will include an analysis of the effectiveness of current technologies to address oil pollution and an assessment and comparison of regional differences in response capabilities. Section 5 of the bill is amended to clarify the required contents of the Federal Oil Pollution Research and Development Plan. Specifically, the amendment clarifies that the plan is to include research to improve the rates of oil recovery, the effectiveness of the response to oil discharges, and the accessibility and utility of the information available to mariners, researchers, and responders. Section 6 of the bill is amended to make clear that each of the agencies in the interagency program, not just NOAA, may award grants or utilize other funding mechanisms to address the research priorities set forth in the research plan. Section 7 of the bill is modified to simplify the reporting requirement by the National Academy of Sciences. Under the manager's amendment, the National Academy will be responsible for submitting to Congress and the Interagency Committee a report evaluating the Oil Pollution Research and Development Program and identifying priority areas of needed research and technology development. Finally, the amendment includes a direct authorization for NOAA and EPA, each in the amount of $2 million a year for fiscal year 2010 through fiscal year 2014. Mr. Chairman, this amendment is based on witness recommendations from the hearing and follow-up conversations with the related federal agencies. I ask my colleagues to please support the manager's amendment. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. In a moment, Mr. Inglis will have a second degree amendment to offer, but before we turn to him, does anyone else have comments they wish to offer on Ms. Woolsey's amendment? If not, then we'll turn to Mr. Inglis to offer his second-degree amendment. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment, Mr. Inglis?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Inglis of South Carolina. This is a second-degree amendment to the amendment offered by Ms. Woolsey to H.R. 2693. This is amendment number 007.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This manager's amendment makes substantial improvements to the underlying bill. There are many aspects of the amendment that I agree with and I think are worthy. However, as I mentioned earlier, I have significant concern with NOAA being named as the chair of the Interagency Committee. Since the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 was passed almost 20 years ago, the U.S. Coast Guard has led the Interagency Committee for Research and Development. This Coast Guard has a proven record of being chair of this committee, encouraging coordination and cooperation that still continues today with annual conferences and monthly phone conference calls with other participating agencies. All three federal witnesses at our hearing 2 weeks ago stated that the current structure works. While there is always room for improvement, it should not require tossing the existing structure that works in favor of something new. NOAA provides strategic and important information on to the on-scene coordinator, either the Coast Guard or EPA, as a science coordinator. They provide information to help track where the oil is moving to. They're in charge of restoration efforts after cleanup has occurred. However, NOAA's focus is not on the response in oil recovery, but on restoration and habitat recovery. NOAA does not even receive R&D funding from the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. I believe the R&D program originally envisioned by Congress after the terrible Valdez spill was to provide better technologies to prevent the oil from causing so much devastation. That means being able to collect it, burn it, or disperse it. The Coast Guard and the Mineral Management Service are the two agencies that conduct the most research in these areas. Although NOAA's scientific contribution to cleanup after oil discharges is world-class, I do not believe being chair of this interagency committee is an appropriate role for them. So I urge the committee to consider the amendment of changing the NOAA to Coast Guard, and I'd be happy to yield the gentlelady to for any response to those observations. Be interested in what
Thank
you. The gentlelady is recognized.
Do I have time, or should I take my own?
If you want to take your time, you want to conclude at this point.
Or are you going to give us some?
Well, actually, if
we'll have 5 minutes if you seek it after Mr. Inglis is done.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, let me reclaim my time then and ask another question so that you can think about this, Ms. Woolsey, as well. So question number one is NOAA as the chair as opposed to Coast Guard. But a second one is that it's an interesting provision you've got about field testing that sounds like it may be a good idea. It is different than what we've done before. As I understand it, U.S. agencies have had to participate with other countries in field testing because it's so difficult for us to get field testing permits. So it may be a good idea to do some field tests, which, as I understand it, means dumping some oil in the ocean and seeing what happens. So it may be a good idea. I just was sort of curious about the process by which you came to that conclusion. Like I say, I'm not necessarily doubting that concept. It's just a fairly new approach for the United States. So. With those two questions, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
thank you very much. In response to field testing, that language is in the 1990 Act, so I don't think we changed anything in that. It was just brought forward. Maybe they haven't been doing enough with it, and maybe we should be doing more, but at least we want to recognize that it's part of what was. And we thought it was a good idea then.
If gentlelady would yield, it's just interesting that apparently the permitting for such a field test is very difficult to accomplish because you're dumping oil in the ocean.
No, true.
So, but if there's a way to streamline it, it sounds like maybe worth pursuing, to try it out.
And possibly using computer models instead of our oceans to show what could happen. Now, I'd like to go on. Thank you. I'm reclaiming my time. My concern, Mr. Inglis, and certainly Mr. Chairman, with the Inglis amendment is that it preserves the status quo. Now, there is nobody that respects and supports the United States Coast Guard more than I. I saved 2 Coast Guard bases. Well, I saved 1 Coast Guard base twice in my district, the Two Rock Coast Guard facility. They are the best partners any community could have. But their focus now is Homeland Security. And because of that, I believe we should be looking elsewhere. I want them to be part of the triad that's going to be running this show, but I want them, I believe that NOAA is the answer to be the chair of it. Part of what we're trying to do in this bill is to restructure our federal oil spill research and prevention and, frankly, breathe some new life into this area. Unfortunately, as it stands, the Coast Guard, who are currently in charge of these efforts under the Interagency Coordinating Committee on Oil Pollution Research, seems to be focused more on Homeland Security. So under the leadership of the Coast Guard, the Coordinating Committee hasn't produced an oil pollution research and technology plan since 1997. That was 12 years ago, and the plan has been in place for 20 years, and they've only had put that plan together once. This really is not their focus, and we need them desperately, but we don't need them to be doing the nitty-gritty, and NOAA's a nitty-gritty kind of agency as far as I can tell when they work with me. That's why I put NOAA at the head of the committee in H.R. 2693, because their science and their expertise is absolutely world-class. And I have, as I said, I not only don't have anything against the Coast Guard, I actually absolutely support them and think they're wonderful. But I believe NOAA is better suited to lead this effort at this time. So, Mr. Chairman, because of this, I oppose the Inglis amendment.
I thank the gentlelady. I appreciate the question raised by the gentleman from South Carolina, and I appreciate the response from the sponsor of the legislation. And this is an issue that I think merits perhaps further discussion between now and final markup, and I'd be happy to recognize the gentleman from South Carolina.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to withdraw the amendment at this point and hope that we can continue the discussion as we move toward the full committee, with just this thought that, it seems to me that when you've got a spill, the thing you need is boats and booms and containment devices and pumps. And my experience is that's what the Coast Guard knows how to do. They do boats, they do pumps, they do booms, they do collection things. And that's what they're good at. NOAA seems to me good at other things. And so they don't really have the resources. A little bit like the situation we've had, the opposite argument, I guess, has been in Antarctica about who pays for the boats down there, and who does the boats. And NOAA is not so great at boats, it seems to me. NSF, in that case, is not so great at boats.
Well, would the gentleman yield?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
With the Costco Busan spill, the Coast Guard was there doing exactly what they were supposed to do. What was missing was the equipment and the strategies on how to, for what the NOAA knows, what the tides will be doing, where the oil will be going, and that's. And I don't think, I'm sure that the Coast Guard will continue to do what the Coast Guard does with its big equipment, but we need new cleanup equipment. We need new ways of training volunteers, for one thing, also. The Coast Guard's not going to do that, I'm sure. But when we watched it, we were absolutely proud of our Coast Guard, but we weren't proud that a lot of what they needed to be working with wasn't even available and hadn't even been thought about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we just wouldn't expect them to be doing that when they're so focused on Homeland Security. And certainly their boats are always available, and they'll know. But we think the committee could be led by more scientists, more scientific leadership.
Well, reclaim my time. I think that it generally makes two important points. One is if you're talking volunteers, you're trying to clean up a spill or contain a spill. It's sort of hard to see how volunteers exactly do that.
Well, it wouldn't be all volunteers. Oh, may I yield back? I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, I just say, make sure I'm getting the point across, is that when you're getting out there to try to contain a spill and get around it with containment vessels, and there may be a role for people in speedboats helping out, but on the other hand, it's probably a matter of really heavy equipment getting out there to get in place. Now, once the spill has happened and there's some remediation and we need birds cleaned up and things like that, certainly there's an opportunity for volunteers. But I'm not real sure that the Coast Guard is a place that has big boats and they're moving in with a lot of power and heavy metal. They don't exactly have time for volunteers to be jumping in with their John boats.
If the gentleman
Would you yield?
Sure, I'd be happy to yield.
Mr. Chairman? It wasn't, yes, the birds, of course, and the beaches,
Right.
but the fishermen, they weren't speedboats. These are our big trolling, fishing vessels that were out there with the booms on each, holding them, and the boom, they weren't adequate. They had no way to, they could have been much more helpful and useful had there been a way to do it.
Yeah, and reclaim my time, what I just point out is that in that moment, what I'd be looking for is somebody who really knows how to operate a boat, which seems to me is the Coast Guard. I'm not sure that NOAA scientists really know how to operate a boat.
Gentleman, yield for a second.
Yeah.
I think your point is well taken about the on-scene response. Remember that this bill has to do with the research side of it, and I think what we could do is, I appreciate the gentleman's offer to withdraw the amendment. I think what happens in a positive sense is both of you are making very good points. But I think they're a bit orthogonal in terms of what the issue before us is. And so what we can try to do in discussion before final markup is find a way to address your concern about the on-the-scene jurisdiction management of the hardware, et cetera, and Ms. Woolsey's concern about the need for ongoing research and the apparent limited application of that kind of research. And that's what I would hope we could discuss before the next markup.
Yes. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to withdraw the amendment at this point and continue the discussion as we go to markup.
I appreciate that, and we'll work together, the three of us and anyone else who's interested to do that. I appreciate that very much. With the second degree amendment having been withdrawn, the vote occurs on the manager's amendment offered by Ms. Woolsey. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment's agreed to. The third amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the chair. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2693, offered by Mr. Baird of Washington, amendment number 017.
Ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. Recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. This amendment is intended to expand their current interagency program and related assessment in two ways. First, the amendment ensures the program will involve research and development into new technologies and methods to respond to oil pollution in Arctic regions. As polar ice continues to melt, the new channels are emerging that allow for increased vessel traffic and also expanded oil exploration in the region. As Arctic transportation increases, we need to have technologies in place to deal with oil spills in these unique environments. Second, this amendment inserts a new requirement into the assessment section of the bill. The assessment should include an investigation into the economic incentives and barriers to the development of new technologies for oil pollution response. Because large oil spills happen infrequently but carry the possibility of an environmental disaster, it is important that we are creating the correct incentive structure for the development of technologies to mitigate and prevent such an accident. This is a common sense amendment. I urge its adoption. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. The opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The fourth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2693, Amendment Number 018, offered by Mr. Lujan of New Mexico.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman from New Mexico for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Congresswoman Woolsey, for your work on the bill. It's important that the federal oil pollution research and development efforts consider incidents that occur in locations across the country, coastal waters, inland waters, and on land. Since the original interagency program focused primarily on coastal oil spills, my amendment adds new requirements to the program assessment and plan to consider and investigate technologies and methods to address oil discharges on land and inland waters. This amendment is based on comments from witnesses at the June 4th Energy Environment hearing and conversations with the related federal agencies involved in the interagency program. I ask my colleagues to support this amendment, and I thank you for consideration. I yield back my time.
Is there further discussion of the amendment?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Ms. Woolsey's recommendation.
I'd just like to thank Congressman Lujan for his addition to this legislation.
Thank you, Ms. Woolsey. I concur with that. I think it's an important addition, and I appreciate his insights and contribution. Any further comments on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The fifth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Inglis. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment, Mr.
Yes,
Inglis?
Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2693, Amendment Number 157, offered by Mr. Inglis of South Carolina.
Ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman from South Carolina for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment will ensure that the technologies and techniques that emerge from the oil spill research program are helpful to non-federal oil pollution response agencies. At a hearing 2 weeks ago, we learned that the California Office of Spill Prevention and Response felt that there were several deficiencies in oil spill research. We also learned that there was work at the federal level that could meet those deficiencies. This amendment will push federal agencies to communicate significant research advancements to state and local oil spill teams and improve their ability to respond to spills. So I would urge the adoption of the amendment.
I commend the gentleman for his amendment. I think it's very constructive. Any other comments from additional members of the panel on this amendment? I would urge support myself with no additional comments. All in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. I thank the gentleman for his amendment. Are there any other amendments? If no, the vote is on the bill, H.R. 2693 as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. I recognize myself to offer a motion. I move that the subcommittee favorably report H.R. 2693 as amended to the full committee. Furthermore, I move that staff be instructed to prepare the necessary committee report and make any technical changes and conforming changes to the bill in accordance with the recommendations of the subcommittee. The question is a motion to report the bill favorably. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. We will now consider H.R. 2729 to authorize the designation of the National Environment Research Parks by the Secretary of Energy and for other purposes. Mr. Lujan has an extended remark, and I will recognize Mr. Inglis for first comments on this legislation.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as I said earlier, I think this is a very helpful bill that permanently authorizes the National Environmental Research Parks, and I appreciate Mr. Lujan's leadership in this area. And it really is a wonderful resource that we have in these parks, and to permanently authorize them certainly makes sense. So I'm happy to be supportive of the bill.
Thanks, Mr. Inglis. I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, that the members proceed with the amendments in the order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered. The first amendment on the roster is an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2729, Offered by
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Offered by Mr. Lujan of New Mexico, amendment number 019.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. Recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Inglis and members of the subcommittee for offering their valuable insight and suggestions at the hearings we held on this bill last week. The 7 national environmental research parks that H.R. 2729 formally authorizes provide unique research environments necessary to understanding the impacts of humans and industrial development on the environment. The parks are largely comprised of preserved land in the natural state on several Department of Energy sites across the country. Many of them have existed for decades. The parks enable studies of the transport of DOE relevant contaminants, long-term variations in climate. I apologize there, Mr. Chairman. It's relevant contaminants, long-term variations in climate, and the evaluation of crops that may be used as feedstocks for bioenergy. With this authorization, these parks will be able to properly support and expand their important research activities. H.R. 2729 also includes public outreach and education components that will support science and technology in the classroom and increase public awareness of environmental science overall. The amendment in the nature of a substitute makes minor technical and clarifying corrections and also improves H.R. 2729 in several ways. It instructs the Secretary of Energy to designate a National Environmental Research Park Coordinator to help coordinate their complementary research activities and ensure information on best practices is shared among the parks. The amendment clarifies that the Office of Science will be the lead agency for supporting the parks within the department. The amendment also ensures that community colleges are included in the environmental education and outreach section. I am grateful to my Republican colleagues for their suggestions, which I incorporated into this amendment as well. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues on the committee as H.R. 2729 goes forward. I ask my colleagues to support the manager's amendment, and I yield back my time.
Is there further discussion on this amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to strike.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, several questions, either for Mr. Lujan or for counsel. We've heard from some of the folks at the NERP sites that there's some concern that the language would prohibit current plans for parts of those sites to be developed and used for research, and that there may be, for example, there's one that's said to be doing physics experiments, and there's some question about whether they could do that in those areas. I certainly don't think that would be the intent of the bill, to prevent NERPs from doing planned development or other types of research on lands that are officially designated as a NERP. I assume that's not the intent, and I wonder if there's something that needs to be made clear if NERP sites are asking us that question. Maybe that's a question for counsel.
Yeah, that is definitely not the intent of the language, and I don't believe that there is any language that within the bill that would prevent them from doing that.
And
So,
Mr. Chairman, if the gentleman would yield,
sure.
One of the changes in the manager's amendment on page 5, line 22, does change one of the concerns that was brought up in the subcommittee discussion from shall include to may include, which should clear up any concerns that they may have had. The intent of this is to continue to explore any research that is taking place to be able to encourage science as opposed to discourage it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some question about whether the protected site language is not connected to that language. Is that right? So that basically there's some question as to whether the entirety of the park should be open for research, which surely what I would hope was the intent is to say, for example, at Savannah River Ecology Lab, that whole 300 square mile area is available to be used for various kinds of experiments rather than put off limits. That's a lot of land that could do a lot of valuable research. We don't want to constrain that research, right?
That is the intent, yes.
Apparently the question arises, what is it, section 2, section 2A. I guess it's on page 3 of the bill, about line 15 and 16. This is where the concern.
And
I'm going to ask counsel to read that section, if you would. Just read it out.
Mr. Chairman, if the gentleman would yield.
Yeah.
the idea of the protected language, Mr. Chairman, is that there's areas of the park that are contaminated, and they should be protected from the public as opposed to protected from the kind of science or research that should take place. And so if that's something that needs to be clarified, Mr. Chairman, I'm sure that we could work on that. But that's the intent of this, to protect it from those that may be come in contact with contaminated areas.
Yeah, reclaim that time. That's certainly important at a place like Savannah River National Lab and the Savannah River site. We want to keep people out of some places that really would be very dangerous to be. But I'm glad to hear that the intent, and I want to make sure we're getting this on the record, the intent is to make it freely available for scientific purposes, because while we've got this incredible asset that we were talking about at that hearing, let's make sure to use it for scientific research and not cordon off areas that could be used for great research. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that between now and committee, full committee, we can see if there are any improvements that need to be made to that language, and hope that we can work together cooperatively to get that done.
I thank the gentleman for his diligence in raising this, and I would certainly make my personal commitment, and I'm sure the council will commit to that as well. I think you raised a very, very good point. We don't want to inadvertently create ambiguity so that we block research where it must occur. And I applaud the gentleman and his staff for raising this issue, and I hope council will commit to work with that as well. Does the gentleman wish to continue?
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Again, I thank the gentleman, and I think he's raised outstanding points. Mr. Levan, let's work together to see what we can do to absolutely clarify that and work that out before it moves to final passage. Are there others? There's a second amendment on the roster, a second degree amendment by Ms. Giffords. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2729, offered by Ms. Giffords of Arizona, amendment number 052.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is pretty simple and builds off the stated purposes of the National Energy Research Parks, or the NERPs. According to the official language and the official charter, the National Environmental Research Parks are actually field laboratories set aside for ecological research, and let me emphasize, for the study of the environmental impacts of energy developments and for informing the public of the environmental and land use options open to them. In other words, studying the environmental impacts on energy technologies was one of the primary purposes stated and envisioned in the NERPs. So you can understand why I was a little dismayed last week during our hearing of H.R. 2729 when I asked one of the witnesses whether or not they were aware of any research being conducted on the environmental impacts of renewable energy technologies, and essentially they indicated, all the panelists, that they weren't aware of any. As most of my colleagues know, I'm a big supporter of renewables, but particularly solar energy. One of the major attractions of renewable energy technologies is obviously it's their relatively low environmental impact compared to traditional energy sources. However, no energy technology, even solar energy, is without any environmental impacts. So this language is pretty simple. It includes the language environmental impacts of development and use of energy generation technologies, including renewable energy technologies, as Section 2B of the bill. And I think it will provide the explicit encouragement for those researchers studying these impacts to look at renewables. I think this is non-controversial, and I think it's consistent with the long-established purposes of the NERPs, and I urge my colleagues to support it.
The gentlelady has a well-established record of commitment to renewable energy. I applaud her for that and think this amendment is thoroughly consistent with that record. Are there any other members of the committee who wish to comment on this amendment? Hearing none, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment in the nature of the substitute. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The vote now occurs on the bill, H.R. 2729, as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Again, I thank colleagues for working together on this bill. Mr. Inglis, you raised some very good points, and we'll work on those before moving into the full committee. I now move that the subcommittee favorably report H.R. 2729 as amended to the full committee. Furthermore, I move that the staff be instructed to prepare the subcommittee report and make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill in accordance with the recommendations of the subcommittee. Question is on the motion to report the bill favorably. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. We now consider H.R. 1622 to provide for a program of research, development, and demonstration on natural gas vehicles. I recognize Mr. Inglis to discuss his bill. This bill.
I thought I grabbed a authorship here, which is pretty great. So,
anything else you want to discuss? Have at it. You got 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is, as I mentioned earlier, I'm very happy to be supportive of this bill, and I think Mr. Sullivan is doing good work here by promoting the development of natural gas vehicles. This is technology we know works. And is available to us, has been used, and it is being used. It just hopefully will increase the competitive position of natural gas and introduce this concept of fuel choice in the transportation sector. Because one of the ways, the best way to break the strategic value of crude oil is to introduce competition and effective fuel choice. And so that's what this bill is about. And so I'm happy to be supportive, and I think there'll be a great support on this side of the aisle for that concept. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. I think the bill is well summarized. I want to thank Mr. Hall and Ranking Member Sullivan and Mr. Inglis for their work on it. Offer my support as we move to take this bill to the full committee. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Davis is recognized for 5 minutes, and I'll turn to Ms. Woolsey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I think as we look at our portfolio today of transportation, I think we've ignored too long the use of natural gas in our automobiles. It is my understanding that natural gas burns much cleaner, some say as much as 75 to 80% cleaner than the fossil fuels that we derive from the other source, and that being crude oil. And as I look at our retooling today and revamping the auto industry, especially as we look at the 2 that are in bankruptcy, it would seem to me very logical that these new automobile companies with the old names should start looking at maybe integrating a storage capacity in the actual structure of those automobiles to where we could get 250 to 300 miles on a fill-up. And I'm not hearing much encouragement as I watch this debate that we have today on climate change. I'm not hearing much debate that this should be one of the major alternatives that we look at that would replace the fuels that we get today from crude oil, most of which is being imported. I was excited the last 12 to 14 months as I heard conversations during the campaigns that natural gas should be and could be the replacement in many cases of fuels derived from crude oil. So it is my hope that as we pass this legislation, I'm not sure that the amount of dollars we're talking about is even adequate, but I think that we have today in this country a valuable resource that is underutilized that can, in fact, play a major role in helping reduce the climate change that we're seeing and can help reduce carbon emissions. And it is my hope that this legislation passes and that we even start exerting more interest in seeing this as an alternative to crude oil.
I thank the gentleman for his comments, and I share his interest in the issue of storage technology. There have been some fascinating work done recently using carbon nanotubes to enhance storage technology of gases, and perhaps we can explore that at a future date. Ms. Woolsey had indicated Ms. Woolsey, did you want to offer comments? No, I didn't. Oh, okay. Are there any additional members wishing to offer comments? If no, I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. Are there any amendments to this legislation? If no, then the vote will occur on the bill. H.R. 1622. All in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. I recognize myself to offer a motion. I move the subcommittee favorably report H.R. 1622 to the full committee. Furthermore, I report that staff be instructed to prepare the subcommittee report and make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill in accordance with the recommendations of the subcommittee. Question is on the motion to report the bill favorably. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. Without objection, and the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. I want to thank members for their attendance. This concludes our subcommittee markup.